Lord, thank you for Mike. Thank you for the time he's put into this preparation as we continue to look at the Gospel of John. We pray that the insights that he brings to us will build our faith, build our trust in you, and help us to walk closer to you. Amen.
Slightly taller than Alison, if you hadn't noticed. Okay, so John chapter 11. It's quite a long chapter with quite a lot in it, and is in essence a chapter which has got 3 parts in it. And I'm going to try and give sort of like a little bit of a whistle-stop view on it, focusing on a few things, if that makes sense. But actually, I'd like to encourage you all to go away and read John chapter 11 afterwards, because there's so much in it. I don't know about doing a sermon on it. You could do a series on what's in John chapter 11. So the 3 things which are a part of it is, one is the obvious thing, is the story of Lazarus, the story of Jesus bringing Lazarus back from the dead. The second thing that sits within it is some conversations which take place in it between Jesus and various people with what's going on there. The third thing in it is the bigger story. It actually sits within the Bible at quite a pivotal point in John, what is happening within the life of Jesus and his ministry. And it leads on to other things. It's in that period where Jesus is starting to get close to Jerusalem. It's interesting that Nick stood up and said it was only just Christmas and we're getting towards Easter. It's a story which starts that move in a timeline towards Jesus moving towards Jerusalem. So I'm going to go through it and I'm going to read it in bits, and I'm going to try and break it down in that and then talk as we go, rather than reading it in a chunk. So we will start with the first part of it, and bear with me as I put my glasses on and off. If you're trying to follow it in your own Bible, this is actually the translation from the New Century Version, so it probably won't follow exactly either the NIV and what you're doing, but it is the translation I have in front of me. A man named Lazarus was sick. He lived in the town of Bethany, where Mary and her sister Martha lived. Mary was the woman who later put perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. Mary's brother was Lazarus, the man who was now sick. So Mary and Martha sent someone to tell Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When Jesus heard this, he said, "The sickness will not end in death. It is for the glory of God, to bring glory to the Son of God." Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. But when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. Then Jesus said to his followers, "Let's go back to Judea." Just to pause at this point, we're all familiar with Mary and Martha and the story of Mary and Martha. We're less familiar with Lazarus, but actually they were a sibling group. Which is, and Lazarus is sick. They send word to Jesus that Lazarus is sick. And interesting, reflecting on last week and what Ruth said, Jesus didn't rush off. He stopped and he paused. He took his time. Moving on to the next bit, which I've coloured differently, because it's a conversation. The followers said, "But teacher, some people there tried to stone you to death." only a short time ago. Now you want to go back there." Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the daylight, he will not stumble, because he can see by this world's light. But if anyone walks at night, he stumbles, because there is no light to help him see." After Jesus said this, he added, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up." The followers said, "But Lord, if he is only asleep, he'll be all right." Jesus meant that Lazarus was dead, but his followers thought he meant that Lazarus was really sleeping. So then Jesus said plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes I was not there, so that you may believe. But let's go to him now." Then Thomas, the one called Didymus, said to the other followers, "Let us also go, so that we can die with him." I think it's fair to say that from the disciples' point of view, there was some hesitance to head back. Certainly, from Thomas's point of view, it's not really a positive comment from there. The fear of going back to Jerusalem, the disciples knew what that would mean, of going back towards Bethany. Just to put it into your hand, Bethany to Jerusalem, if you go back to the medieval period, is as West Bridgford is to Nottingham. It's about 3 miles from Jerusalem. It's just outside the city. It's a quick walk into Jerusalem. For a 33-year-old, you'll be there in no time. So it's not like it was going to Bethany and it was somewhere in Nottinghamshire. It's like just outside the city. It's not like it's somewhere around Jerusalem in sort of a broad area. It's just outside the city. Moving forward back to the story of Lazarus. When Jesus arrived, he learned that Lazarus had already been dead and in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was about 2 miles from Jerusalem. Many Jews had come there to comfort Mary and Martha and their brother. When Martha heard Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you anything you ask." Jesus said, "Your brother will rise and live again." Martha answered, "I know that he will rise and live again in resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me will have life even if they die. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." Martha, do you believe this? Martha answered, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, the one coming to the world." We'll unpick a little bit to talk about this conversation between Martha and Jesus as I move on later. But as you see, there's the story, and then there's conversations going on in it, and what's going on in people in the heads of the disciples and those people who knew Jesus at this time. So, moving forward. After Martha said this, she went back and talked to her sister Mary alone. Martha said, "The teacher is here, and he is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to Jesus. Jesus had not yet come to the town, but he was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews were with Mary in the house, comforting her. When they saw her stand and leave quickly, they followed her, thinking that she was going to the tomb to cry there. But Mary went to the place where Jesus was. When she saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw Mary crying, and the Jews who came with her also crying, he was upset and was deeply troubled. He asked, Where did you bury him?" "Come and see, Lord," they said. Jesus cried. Just checking his mood. So the Jews said, "See how much he loved him." But some of them said, "If Jesus had opened the eyes of a blind man, why couldn't he keep Lazarus from dying?" Again, feeling very upset, Jesus came to the tomb. It was a cave with a large stone covering the entrance. Jesus said, "Move the stone away." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said, "But Lord, it has been 4 days since he died. There will be a bad smell." Then Jesus said to her, "Didn't I tell you that if you believe, you would see the glory of God?" So they moved the stone away from the entrance. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know you will always hear me. But I say these things because of the people around me. I want them to believe that you sent me." After Jesus said, he cried out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and his feet wrapped with pieces of cloth, and the cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take the cloth off him and let him go." You know, Jesus does miracles in the Bible. There's water into wine. There's driving out spirits. There's healing people who are sick. I've spent a lot of time in my life sitting in conferences and healing events where you sort of see people come forward for healing and things. And there's always like that little question in your mind. It's like, were they really that ill? I'm not being negative here, but it's like, there is no doubt in the story of Lazarus. The man was dead, and Jesus raised him from life. There's no question in that, is there? Is this really a miracle? It's like, he was dead, he smelled, he was starting to decompose, and now he's not. Right, moving on, the final bit of the chapter from this point of view, which I'm just going to read through, is the bit which then leads on to Jesus going towards Jerusalem. So I will read through that as well. Many of the people who had come to visit Mary saw what Jesus did, believed him, but some went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the leading priests and Pharisees called a meeting of the council. They asked, "What should we do? This man is doing many miracles. If we let him continue doing these things, everyone will believe in him. Then the Romans will come and take away our temple and our nation." One of the men who was there, Caiaphas, the high priest that year, said, "You people know nothing. You don't realise that it is better for one man to die for the people than the whole nation to be destroyed." Caiaphas did not think of this himself. As high priest that year, he was really prophesying that Jesus would die for their nation and for God's scattering children to bring them all together and make them one. I'm going to have to read this from there because I've not printed a bit out. That day they started planning to kill Jesus, so Jesus no longer travelled openly among the people. He left there and went to a place near the desert, to a town called Ephraim, and stayed there with his followers. It was almost time for the Passover festival. Many from the country went up to Jerusalem before the Passover to do special things to make themselves pure. The people looked for Jesus and stood in the temple asking each other, "Is he coming to the feast? What do you think?" But the leading priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where Jesus was, he must tell them. Then they could arrest him. So I just need to get my notes sorted out. Sorry, I've printed them off and they're in the wrong order. So just bear with me. Well, I've turned a page and they're in the wrong order. Talk amongst yourself for a minute, please, if you can do. Just That would be very good. Okay, excellent. I found where I am. So, John chapter 11, the story. When I was reading up on this, I've got a book which is very useful, I've found over the years, by Alexander Weil, and it's a book on Bible characters. He's done 2 books, and it's got all the characters in the New Testament, or all characters in the Old Testament, and he talks about them. It's very useful when you're talking on a character, because you can just read up what it says. And one of the things that he says is it is amazing that this is the only place in the Bible that Lazarus is mentioned. Totally amazing. Jesus clearly knew Lazarus very well. You know, he's Mary and Martha's brother. Mary and Martha are mentioned. He is described as being the friend of Jesus. Not just a friend, not just one of his friends. And actually, there aren't many people in the Bible described as Jesus' friends. It does say that anyone who knows him will be a friend of Jesus, but it describes Mary and Martha as being Jesus' friend and the disciples as being Jesus' friend and Lazarus. And yet only here is Lazarus mentioned. And I wonder whether that's actually because Lazarus was the friend that Jesus spent time with when he was on downtime. Because actually, if you think about it, Mary and Martha and Lazarus, a family of 3, I don't know about, was Lazarus the person Jesus went to the garage with, if that makes sense, or the workshop with, and just chatted about things and made things when he wasn't talking to people, when he wasn't, because Jesus lived a life. Was Lazarus, it doesn't know, because the Bible doesn't tell us much about Lazarus. But what it does is it tells us that he was Jesus' friend. He had a very, very deep relationship with Jesus. We've all got good friends, haven't we, who we go back to when we've been away travelling and doing stuff and we don't see. A little while ago, we've got some friends who we knew from London called Terry and Claudette, and I was somewhere where I just bumped into Terry. I'd not seen him for years, and it was like we hadn't been apart, if that makes sense. You just catch up with him. And I think Lazarus was that sort of friend to Jesus. But also, what a task Jesus gave to Lazarus. He's not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible. He doesn't do anything else. But he gives him this massive job. Lazarus dies so that Jesus can demonstrate his resurrection power. And actually, Lazarus goes from being somebody who you've never heard of, who's not talked about in the Bible, who perhaps is the brother of Mary and Martha, who just keeps his head down, working in the background. He dies. Jesus raises him to life again. And then if I jump forward and read the next chapter, apologies if I'm treading on somebody else's feet here. Verse 9 of chapter 12, a large crowd of Jews heard about that Jesus was in Bethany. Hang on, this is very small. And went out there. Hang on, I'm wearing my wrong glasses. Basically, Lazarus. Oh, I can't read that. But basically, if you read further, they went out to try and kill Lazarus because he was such a threat. So he'd gone from living his day-to-day life to being a person who the priests wanted dead because of the threat he gave. What a task that was for Lazarus. And if Lazarus truly knew Jesus, he'd died and he'd gone to be with him. And then it's like, come back so they can kill you again. We don't know what happened, but it's quite a task, isn't it? So Jesus knew him very well, but actually the expectation on Lazarus was for a very big job, a small job, which is only mentioned a little bit. What a massive task. So anyway, that's the story of Lazarus. I'm going to jump on to the conversations briefly. I said I wasn't, because otherwise we'd be here for like half the week. So the conversations which go on, what are we going to pick up from these two conversations? I think the first thing is, if we look at the conversation that Jesus had with the disciples, is the fact that the death of Lazarus is a sign of Jesus' power over death. If you hold it in the context of going forward into Holy Week, in this Jesus raising Lazarus from death, Jesus has proved that he has power over death. In barely over a week's time after this happens, Jesus is put to death. And then 3 days later is raised. There are parallels in the story. But Jesus raising to death doesn't involve somebody coming up there and saying, "Come out, be alive." Jesus is just raised. It doesn't involve somebody having to come and push the stone away. The stone is gone, if that makes sense. So I think that's there in the conversation, and a sort of a going deeper with the disciples. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of depth on it. Just go away and read it and read up on things. The thing I want to focus on a little bit more is Martha's conversation with Jesus. It's quite clear on here, is if you look at the conversation that Martha had with Jesus, she starts it from a point of Jesus being a teacher and ends it with seeing Jesus as being the Son of God. You are the Christ. You know, Martha has spent time with Jesus, and if you go back and think about the story of Martha, you know, Jesus has a conversation with Martha. Stop busying yourself out there doing everything. Stop making the coffee. Stop organising things. Come and sit at my feet, as Mary does. And then in this, Martha is like, "Oh, I see who you are now. I actually see it all. I see you in more than I've seen you before." So as I say, there's things to learn from those conversations from people in this chapter. And as I said, the bigger story in here, the raising of Lazarus, is a glimpse of what is going to happen in the week to come. It's a demonstration of Jesus' power over death. It brings Jesus back to the point where he starts to move towards the story of Holy Week, the story of Good Friday, of Easter Sunday, and of what goes on. And perhaps it's because Jesus knew where the disciples were at. There's that bit where, you know, Thomas at the start of it, it's like, "Don't go back there. We'll get killed. They'll all stone us to death." There's a lack of faith there earlier on amongst the disciples. And I think Jesus saw that and thinks, you know, I need to... you know, there's that step-by-step thing, isn't it? Let's prove the power over death thing here. Because with Lazarus, I have power over death. You see that. Is maybe this was important for the disciples, because at the point where Jesus raised, they'd seen that Jesus had power over death with Lazarus 10 days before. You know, there's no, that question, is somebody stolen the body? When Jesus comes out of the tomb. Maybe if this hadn't happened, that question of has somebody stolen the body would have sat there for longer, if that makes sense, and would have been. But actually, everybody knows about this, and it's not just the disciples. You know, the high priests are after Lazarus because he's done. But as I said, there's been miracles, and then there's this. There is no doubt from it's a dead person who's been dead for days, and now they're alive. That isn't explainable away. So, there are three key things in here. As I said, I'm not going to go into this passage endlessly because it's long and you could sit down and look at it and things. I think the first thing I just want to pick up on is the reality of the friendship. You know, Jesus clearly was a friend of Lazarus. He was upset. He cried about Lazarus' death. He spent time with him. He's described as Lazarus is the one that he loved. Jesus loves us deeply. He loves relationship with people. He loves spending time with us. And not just time that everybody else sees, but time when it's just with us. Jesus clearly spent a lot of time with just Lazarus when it wasn't about people around. Jesus is interested in that friendship, that reality of friendship. The reality of power over death in this story, Jesus has the power over death. He demonstrates it here. And in a week and a bit, in the timeline of this, it's demonstrated by Christ coming back to life. And the final thing I want to leave you with here is Martha's revelation, reality, in that conversation with Martha of, I believe you are the Christ, Son of God. She'd known Jesus, she'd spent time with Jesus, she'd seen miracles, she'd had personal conversations about her busyness and her need to sit with him. But at this moment in time, despite the 3 years and maybe longer, we don't actually know if Jesus knew Mary, Nazareth and Lazarus for a longer period, if that makes sense. It's just not there. We don't know. But at that point in time, despite having had a relationship with Jesus, she went, oh, actually, I really see you. I really know who you are. And I say that. And I think that's a challenge to all of us, those things. So I want to leave you with a challenge is wherever we are in our relationship, do we really see Jesus? And do we really know him? And actually, do we sometimes need to remind ourselves quite what that is? And maybe the other thing I want to just leave us with a challenge about is that friendship. Is that detachedness is actually Jesus is really interested in really being a friend to us, spending our time, sharing our heart's desire, being that person who we talk to when we need to talk to somebody about whatever. So I will leave those 3 thoughts with you and encourage you to go away and read chapter 11 again and unpack some of the other stuff that's in there, because there is lots of stuff. Alison.